For the next half an hour or so, let's talk about real-world accessibility, specifically what it's like to be blind and use the web here in 2023. Slide 21. Joining me today is Eric Yarberry, an educator, an advocate for the blind and visually impaired, and the president and CEO at World Services for the Blind. Eric is blind, and as we get started, I wanted to mention something that will be a little different about this chat. I will be occasionally unmuting as we speak together to provide the type of yeahs, okays, and other social cues that we sometimes keep muted and convey gesturally or with facial expression in video conferences. So while this may be a little different and a little distracting, I hope you can get used to it since it's important to a good conversation, which I can't wait to get into. So right now, I'm just going to stop sharing my slides for a sec. And now you can just see our faces here. We're both up on the screen. So Eric, welcome. It's great to have you with us today. To get started, oh, sorry to talk over you.
No, you're fine. I was just saying thank you, Dan.
To get started, can you take a sec and tell us a bit about who you are and what you do?
Yep. So like Dan said, my name's Eric. I'm the president and CEO at World Services for the Blind. I've been blind my entire life, and so I'm honored to be representing our community on this call today, and hope you guys are able to take away some things as well. And it's fun getting to provide services to blind and visually impaired individuals. A lot of what I do is work with adults who lose their vision later in life, and as you'll hear, that may come up in our call about how to teach blind or visually impaired individuals how to use the web, and some of the things that we'll talk about and how that impacts us blind individuals just on our day-to-day lives. So thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Thanks for the introduction. To get started, you mentioned you're an educator. What kind of advice or warnings do you give to newly blind students learning about how to interact with digital sites and services?
Yeah. So one of the first things I always tell folks is that you've got to relearn the internet. So the internet is very visual based, and one of the big tips that I give our blind individuals is that whenever you're learning the internet, you've got to understand that a lot of the content for a website is, it's on the screen when you first open it, and those are the most important things. It's the same way when you read a newspaper, that there's a concept above the fold, and what's on that front page is the most important. And we have to teach them how a screen reader actually reads a website. And one of the ways I encourage people to stay motivated and stay positive about it is to find a website that they really like to use, whether that's shopping or social media or videos, and use that and go back to that and build their skills, because they'll be motivated to go back to that. And oftentimes individuals who have just lost their vision, we encourage them to pick up a mobile device and learn to use the accessibility tools built on a mobile device, and then gradually build up to a desktop type computer.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think that's something that's kind of important to us at the design system, like understanding that the mobile web has, I think, particular importance for blind users, and that folks who are blind or newly blind are coming and using their devices as maybe they're one of the first really accessible devices, and
Absolutely.
that is a gateway to the web.
Yeah.
Now, I was wondering, can you think back to a time when you had a website experience that was particularly frustrating to you? Can you describe that experience and how you dealt with it?
Yeah. So I was cooking, making a recipe, pulled up a recipe on my phone, and the website had an ad, and it was on a timer. So if you guys have seen this before, the ad will tick down, 15 to 0, and normally it's not frustrating because that means the ad's going to change and you just ignore it. But for someone who's using screen reader software, what that does is every second that changes, it announces that second. So I'm trying to read this recipe and it just keeps reading the timer. Or I'll open even in a similar situation, I'll open the website and there will be an automatic video that starts playing. I'm starting to see more and more websites in these types of situations that are the video is automatically muted, which is awesome, where you have to unmute it. But for the ads that aren't even audible, it still has the timer on those. And I think that's the most frustrating thing. But what you have to do in those situations, and more advanced screen reader users do as well, is you go through, scroll down the website, screenshot it, go into your images and import it into an ocular character recognition app. So it's a lot of work around to read a recipe. But if I don't know how to make something offhand, I'm still going to try and find a way to do it. So it's just, you just kind of get used to, especially being blind, you just kind of get used to having to piece things together and always problem solve. And but that's definitely one of the most frustrating experiences.
Thanks, Eric. It's always really impressive to me when I hear about the type of creative problem solving that users of assistive technology sometimes have to do to get to what they need. And it can be truly eye-opening and inspiring in a way to understand just how creative and just how tenacious folks have to be to get what they deserve. And so it's always something to hear about that.
Yeah, and it's something I tell our the folks that we work with too, is if you're new to this, you have to be a problem solver. And that's the internet is, I appreciate you guys who are trying to make it accessible. That's fantastic, but it is not entirely accessible. So
you brought up a thing like excessive vocalizations from something like an ads countdown timer, where someone might have considered that to be an accessibility feature in a way,
yeah.
But it definitely did not turn out that way from a usability perspective.
No, not at all.
Do you find websites, you've been using the web for probably some time, do you find websites more usable and accessible today than they were in the past? And what are the kinds of things that are better, and maybe what are some of the things that might be worse?
I absolutely find them more accessible. I remember, so now CSS is really established, and I remember when Flash was a thing, and I know people are probably cringing because that's how I feel. And then websites, when people would develop websites, the design of them would be in a table. And if you understand the way screen readers work, it reads it basically throws everything into one column. You start at the top and you read all the way down. Of course, there are keyboard commands and different techniques you can use to navigate, more quickly. But in a sense, the development of websites has come so much further, and alt text is fantastic. CSS makes things a lot easier. Headings, just these things that what you don't, most of us take for granted, has definitely made a huge impact.
Yeah. Are there any things that you might have noticed that are getting worse? There might not be any things. It might just all be improvements. But have you noticed anything that's maybe a problem?
Yeah. So ads, there are whenever you visit websites that has the potential to have a paywall, there may be an ad that pops up, or a join our newsletter, and what happens sometimes is I can't find the close button on the pop-up. So sometimes you have to close a browser and reopen a browser just to get out of it. And then screen readers will instead of saying close, it'll read the X, what you guys see as an X, as times or X. So you kind of have to keep these things in mind and know that times is what you need to press enter on, or X is what you need to press enter on. So there's all different things that you just kind of have to take in mind. But pop-ups are definitely they're everywhere.
Well, I can tell you that they're also not particularly enjoyable for a sighted user as well, but I can imagine that it's just an additional layer of something to work through to get to what you need.
Yeah, and when you need them, like when there's a form that pops out asking for additional information and you're supposed to fill out information on that form that pops out, sometimes you can't find it. So yeah, it's both ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's say you're visiting a site for the first time. Like, first off, do you ever worry before visiting a new website for the first time? And then maybe beyond that, like, what are your green flags or your red flags when visiting a site? What are your first indications that a website or service experience is going to be particularly good or particularly bad?
Immediately I have to fall back to image descriptions. That's very helpful. Anytime there's graphics on web pages that are described, that works out very well. Heading structure, of course. And then if there are links that are properly labeled instead of click here for this item. So just click here makes it very tough to find items. So that's a couple green flags and red flags, but I think mainly what just kind of tells me like a website is, so one thing I want to touch on is what you don't really think about is that blind people have jobs, and during the day, and a lot of things that makes these jobs available to blind and visually impaired individuals is that software and websites are accessible. And if I get on a website that, isn't a favorite popular website to go to, but I need to go to it for work, and it just seems like a field of links, and the forms are the fields are mislabeled or are not even labeled. If I have to navigate a form that has unlabeled edit boxes, I'll enter into the form and then have to escape out, shift tab, read the name, tab twice again to get to the next field, and it is a chore. So I'd say my top two things to recognize if a website is actually accessible still is probably headings first of all, and then properly labeled links. That just makes it so much easier.
Thanks, Eric. You mentioned a little bit about alt text and descriptions for images. From your perspective, what makes good alt text, and maybe like how good do you think you have to be as a visualizer in your head, like as a blind person? How much work do you find yourself doing in your head to make sense of what folks are describing to you?
Yeah. So first of all, so blind people, just to give you guys an idea, we still say see you later, and did you watch that movie? And so don't tiptoe around words like that. Just be direct. You're talking to a friend. And I think once you kind of figure that out, you're okay. And then also show, don't tell. Assume that if you're describing a meme, make sure that you actually just say the people or the subjects who is in there. And if I don't understand it, I just didn't get the meme. It's not your fault. So just be direct, act like you're describing it to a friend. And I promise you, any image description is better than none. So use color, and then just keep it brief. I think if you keep it brief, describe the subjects. If there's any words in it, say what those words say. But keep it brief and act like you're talking to a friend, and don't be scared to use words that imply vision. So those are the things that I think are important, and it definitely it definitely makes our lives easier. We really appreciate it. I don't get to thank the people that write image descriptions on websites because I don't always know who they are. So thank you.
I think it's an interesting observation to almost to think about, images like, not every image is a meme, obviously, but
Right.
every image has like a point, there's like a thing that you're trying to convey,
Yeah.
whether it's a joke or whatever, like, and that thing should be graspable, and you should
Yeah.
be able to usually to try to get it as quickly as possible. You're not always telling a joke, but sometimes an image description might have like the structure of like trying to convey that essence, and try to convey something quickly, so you're not belaboring the point.
Yeah.
Um, what about things like data visualizations, like charts and graphs? Is there anything that you consider important with alt text for charts and graphs? And do you ever browse something like raw data if it's included with a data visualization?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that I appreciate, I always appreciate an image description of if there's a data trend and you can briefly explain that, that's great. But also provide access to the raw data. That helps a lot, rather than just an image, a flow chart, or an infographic, something like that. Provide the raw data somewhere accessible, and that's
Mm-hmm.
someone can actually access it, because I like spreadsheets. I don't mind opening up spreadsheets. I know how to use spreadsheets and formulas and things of that nature, and that's someone who's been using a screen reader for a while is not going to have a problem, and it's easy for us to access it that way. So
Mm-hmm.
just kind of recap, just briefly describe if there's any obvious trends that are, and provide context and why it's important, and then provide the raw data.
Thank you. So it's probably clear that that at least occasionally you'll visit a site or a service where you'll notice something that you feel like it could be improved about the accessibility of that site or service. Like, and often, and it is a requirement on U.S. government sites that there should be an accessibility link, a link to an accessibility statement, and a way to provide feedback. Like, do you follow those types of links, accessibility links, and provide feedback when you find accessibility issues on sites? Like, and what do you hope happens if you're able to provide feedback? What do you hope to find on an accessibility page?
Absolutely. So I always will try and find accessibility links if I have an issue, or if I notice the website is really well done. I think it's important because a lot of the people that we work with are frustrated, and they don't know how. So someone's got to speak up, I feel like, and it doesn't always have to be everyone, but I always use those accessibility links if they're there. One thing that we'll start off with, the positive here. One thing that's great
Mhm.
is if I can access the accessibility link and there's a field to provide suggestions, and where I can actually put in my contact information, and then a statement of the efforts of that organization that site is tied to. Of course, that's the dream. And then also, if possible, a name of someone who is kind of in charge of the accessibility efforts.
Mhm.
That may not be possible for some people, but if I fill out that form, a response within the first 48 hours would be awesome. I think when I'm accessing that form, I am doing it with the intentions of actually using the website. I'm not, in most cases, I'm not going to complain. And I mean this respectfully, but if I think the website isn't accessible and I don't need to use the website, I could go find the information somewhere else. I'm just going to go somewhere else. I'm not. So But in some cases where it's for work, or I really like the services, but it's just not accessible, I am there to work with those folks to make it accessible. And I don't want to come across as a nuisance. Trust me, it's not my intention. I didn't choose to be blind. It's just the fact of the matter. But I want to come across, and I even teach the folks that I work with to be respectful and know that, it's not people's first intention to be inaccessible. So just be open-minded. And I definitely I don't like feeling like when I make a recommendation that's just going into a void. So any support that you guys can provide, if you're watching those forums, know that it is really appreciated. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I think you'd mentioned it, but it's kind of like you hope, you're saying that I think you hope to have a conversation perhaps, and to figure out a way to get to some sort of resolution in most instances. So you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And in most cases would provide feedback on changes and would help support that. So 100%.
Cool. I think that's I know that's something that we are sort of actively working toward, is to make that type of relationship more obvious, and to make that kind of feedback mechanism more obvious, and to make that sort of a priority as we move forward, beyond the requirement that it already is. We talked a little bit about alt text for images, but I don't know if you have a perspective on this, but would you prefer that every sort of visible image on a page be accessible and described with good alt text, or would you prefer that someone makes a decision about which images are decorative or don't add to the content of the page? Would you prefer that what we might think of as decorative images be hidden from screen reader users?
Personally, I don't mind if the images that you have on your page are actually images with good content, like that bring context to the page. Have alt text in those, and you can make like borders and things like that decorative. I also think that if you're going to do that, first get in the habit of doing alt text before you start making decisions on which ones you're going to hide and which ones you're not. I've seen websites with what they will do is they'll have images in the background of their site and have text laid over it. And if it's an important image, even if you provide alt text in the background, it may not be accessible to a screen reader. So first, understand how to write good alt text. Know that decorative images are not necessary, but get the alt text down first before you start making decisions like that.
Great. Thank you, Eric. I had just a couple more quick questions, and then we'll jump into Q&A from the chat. And the first was whether, in your experience, whether you've noticed differences in accessibility expectations between newly blind users or folks who have been using assistive technology for a long time. Are there any differences that you think that we as people who make websites should be aware of in how different types of blind and visually impaired users use the web?
Yeah, so no one person has the same vision as the next person, even in the visually impaired community, unless they're totally blind. Even people who have light perception have different types of light perception. So first of all, make sure that your website is friendly to colorblind individuals. That helps a lot. Let's get that out of the way. And then I think kind of what you're getting at is that if someone has recently lost their vision, how in the world do they actually get all of the context of the page, like they would a sighted person. And I think those folks need, they need more image descriptions. They need more detail. They need more of these like upfront in your face details than someone who's been using screen reading software their entire life. For me, I, like you heard me talk about earlier with the recipe website, I've got workarounds, and I know I know how to problem solve. But you've got to. We don't want basic websites. You don't want something that's visually unappealing. I understand that, but you want something that, if you're trying to get information to a visually impaired user, you want it immediately accessible, whether that's right on the main page as soon as you open the website, or if there's a way to even, what I'll do sometimes is some articles, websites, they'll have like print friendly versions. So if you just click print, that's a really neat feature too. And we teach that.
What happened? What would you do when, after you select print?
So there's a print feature, and you can print it to PDF or to text, and then sometimes you can just click print and it'll pull it a text only page. And some websites have screen reader friendly versions, so you can just go to the mobile version in the web browser on a desktop, and it takes out a lot of the images and the widgets and that kind of thing. So
cool. So the next and the final question that I have, Eric, before we take questions from the chat, is just what is, and we've talked maybe about it a little bit, but what's something you wish more people knew about how blind people use the web?
Really, first of all, is that blind people do use the internet. I think that shocks people. I will make comments on websites and, like, hey, I appreciate this from a blind perspective. And I'll get replies to my comments like, wow, how are you blind? You're using the internet. And I'm like, oh man, here we go. So I don't go round and round with people anymore, because I'm like, it's not my goal to educate the world. That's hard for one person to do, but here we are. And I appreciate this opportunity to get to share my experiences with you guys, but know that blind people do access the internet. And especially with technology, that's how we do our jobs. And that's keeping blind and visually impaired folks employed and actually providing meaningful lives. And we could go down that rabbit hole, but I think it's just important to know that we do access the internet, and we do appreciate the adjustments you make to your websites and your content. It helps so much. It really does.
Great. Thank you for answering these questions and being here with us today, Eric. It's really great to hear from you and to hear that perspective.